Okay, let's get into new stuff then. I've already drawn on the board where we're going, so I'll just explain this diagram. We've gotten through our to-do list. As we go over here, the new diagram for today, as I promised last time, we would zoom into the tetrapod clade. So tetrapods include amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. We see that nested within the reptiles group is where we're going to find birds. And if we just look at some of the characteristics that distinguish these groups, we saw last time in a video that amphibians had a moist skin. They had eggs that did not have any type of shell, so they required moisture in order to develop. And we saw some crazy ways in which amphibians prevented their skin from drying out and prevented those eggs from also drying out. And as I had plugged today, we're going to talk about reptiles and mammals that have figured out how to break that link with water. Both reptiles, mammals, and even birds are going to have waterproof skin. So no longer will we see moist skin. Also, we will see in all cases, mammals, birds, and reptiles are going to lay a shelled egg. And that shelled egg is going to prevent the embryo from drying out. So these really break their link with water and are going to start to speciate in a wide variety of ways, kind of like we saw the gymnosperms that broke their link with water speciate in a wide variety of ways. In fact, the reptiles have protected their, let me say this another way. I said reptiles, mammals, and birds all have waterproof skin. They each waterproof their skin with a unique structure. In the case of reptiles, they have scales they're formed out of a protein called keratin, and they're very effective at waterproofing the body of the organism. This is a snake skin that I found in my neighbor's yard just, I think, 2 days ago. This is from a chicken snake or a rat snake. And this thing, you can see, I haven't even stretched it out, would be almost 5 foot long. These are considered non-venomous beneficial snakes because they keep your rodent population at a minimum. And they're not going to try and hurt you, even though I've been bitten by one. What you're feeling here are the scales and that keratin protein. What's interesting is that just a single point mutation in the protein that builds the scale, if you change that protein in just a slight basic way, it converts those scales into feathers. So birds we see, and we'll talk about, and Catherine and I were just talking about this a second ago, that feathers show up in reptiles. All birds are going to have feathers, but we'll see that there is indications in the fossil record that some dinosaurs also had feathers that were not being used for flight. Birds use a lot of these feathers for waterproofing the body. They're very effective at waterproofing. They're also very good at insulation. So feathers are going to be used for insulation before they're going to be used for flight. We're going to see birds have additional adaptations, not just the feathers that help them get into the air. But again, birds have feathers made out of keratin, reptiles have scales made out of keratin, and a different point mutation changes that scale. Instead of changing it into a feather, it changes that scale into a hair. So scales, feathers, and hair are all made out of the keratin protein. Hair is one of those unique features that mammals have. You can see I've listed at least 4 other unique characteristics that belong to mammals that we won't see on reptiles or amphibians. And then as we look into each group, you can see I have tried to simplify the reptile groups that I drew on the board. These are all the living examples of reptiles. When we look at some of the slides, we're going to see it's a little more detailed. It includes some extinct examples of reptiles like the dinosaurs. I've left those off of the list here. So more explanation when we look at the reptiles. If we look into the mammal group, there are 3 of these subphyla or subgroups of mammals. Protheria, I'll just say this term theria means giving birth to live young. Protheria just means before giving birth to live young. So these are going to be still egg-laying mammals. We said mammals, reptiles, and birds all lay eggs. And the primitive example of mammals, this Protheria, still lays eggs. There are two examples of mammals, however, that have figured out live birth. So I've added a characteristic here of live birth. Mammals that give birth to live young do so in a two possible ways. In this group of Metatheria, these describe the pouched mammals, where the young are born alive, but only about 2 weeks to a month old, and they have to crawl to a pouch and finish developing outside of the mother's womb in a pouch, hence the name marsupials. Then the last group of mammals that also give birth to live young, their young are going to be nourished through a placenta in the womb and are going to become almost fully developed before they're born. So eutherians just means true live birth, and those are going to be nourished through a placenta. When we look through reptiles and mammals, we're going to make a couple of broad comparisons. In addition to just general characteristics between reptiles, mammals, and birds, I wanted to make this distinction between warm-bloodedness and cold-bloodedness. So I'm coming back over here to the chart, our to-do list, because as we compare reptiles and mammals, somewhere towards the beginning of this lecture, I want to make a distinction between endothermic, this being warm-blooded, versus being ectothermic or cold-blooded. We'll see that both have an advantage and a disadvantage, and I'm sure it'll be good to know which one is an advantage and which one is a disadvantage for both being either warm-blooded or cold-blooded. We still doing okay? All right, jumping into it. Like I said last time, we were going to zoom into this clade of tetrapods, and that's what we've drawn on the board. All tetrapods have 4 legs, and then if we look inside that clade of tetrapods, we've got amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. We remember from last time there are 3 orders of amphibians. Urodela would be the salamanders and newts. Anura is the largest of those amphibian orders, and it includes the frogs and the toads. And then Apoda was a order of amphibians that had lost their legs altogether. We saw caecilians as an example of that group. So again, moist skin, their eggs did not have a shell, so both of the skin and the egg could dry out. And that has now been fixed as we zoom into reptiles and mammals. Again, the egg is protected by a shell, so it's not going to dry out. And then the organisms, the mammals, the reptiles, and birds, each have their own structure that waterproofs the body, either scales, hair, or feathers. All 3 are made out of keratin. All right, here's what that shelled egg is protecting. You can see the developing embryo is inside. So this would be, if we're cracking an egg open, this would be the egg yolk, the yellow part of the egg. And then what surrounds the yellow part of the egg is the albumin, the white part of the egg. And that albumin is really just there to prevent this embryo from drying out. It has almost the same consistency as seawater. Inside this developing egg yolk, we're going to notice 3 structures. The first structure is called an amnion. That's this blue sac that is protecting the embryo. So the embryo is inside a little, I would call it an air bag, but it's filled with fluid, this amniotic fluid. So there's a fluid bag that kind of cushions this embryo. So it's got protection. It needs nutrients and it needs a way to get rid of waste. So the other 2 sacs, there is what's called a yolk sac, and this is what's giving the developing embryo nutrients. It's the digestive system. And then the other sac that you can see is kind of stretched out along the surface of that egg yolk. This stretched out sac is called the allantois. The allantois is the waste sac. So nutrients is given to the embryo by way of the yolk sac. Then the allantois, we said, is the waste sac. It's also where gas exchange occurs. That's why you see it stretched out across the surface of that egg yolk. Enough surface area for gas exchange to occur. So again, inside the mammals, the birds, and the reptiles that have shelled eggs, these are the structures inside that shelled egg. Here are some reptiles popping out of those shelled eggs. If we think about the reptile group, it's a pretty large clade. If we think about the reptiles as a true clade, we would include obviously the common ancestor of reptiles and all their descendants. Somewhere in that lineage of reptile descendants includes the dinosaurs, and some of those dinosaur descendants include the birds. This is the chart that, like I said, this is more detailed because it has examples of extinct reptiles as well as living examples of reptiles. And I probably chose the wrong color, but what I added to this slide is I wanted to draw lines through the ones that were extinct. But I don't know if you can even see that a line has been drawn through them because it's kind of a light blue. Para-reptiles, these were reptiles that were around during the Permian era, about 300 million years ago. They're some of the first reptiles that formed right before that mass extinction at the end of the Devonian period. Turtles, you can see, have a dotted line here because we know turtles are still alive today. So we can grab a turtle, we know it's cold-blooded, we know it's got scales, we know it lays eggs, it's got all the characteristics that reptiles have, but it's such an ancient lineage that the complete evolutionary history of the turtle lineage is still being hashed out. Hence the dotted line. We don't know exactly where the first turtles fit into this tree of reptiles. But that's why I say it's one of the great times to be involved in the field of biology, because these new molecular tools within your lifetime, probably within the next 10 years, are going to rewrite this part of the textbook, and everybody will have to buy an updated version of the textbook. So the ones that are still with us, we've got turtles, we've got crocodiles, which are a little more derived. Crocodiles are going to have a 4-chambered heart. Crocodiles are still alive, so we can go and test the crocodiles. We know that crocodiles are cold-blooded, just like turtles. They've got scales, they lay eggs, all the characteristics that we associate with reptiles. You can see the next few groups these are extinct reptiles. Pterosaurs were the flying reptiles, those big flying dinosaurs. Ornithischian dinosaurs are the plant-eating dinosaurs. And then the last group, these Saurischian dinosaurs, are meat-eating dinosaurs. And you can see the birds' closest living relative are those meat-eating dinosaurs. I didn't draw that much detail on this chart just to save space, but here's something that I'm about to get into. I'll get through this list first, but let me plant this. Birds are warm-blooded. Crocodiles are cold-blooded. So somewhere between crocodiles and birds, that is, somewhere in this lineage of dinosaurs, warm-bloodedness had to show up. That's fascinating because warm-bloodedness has evolved separately on 2 different branches of this animal evolutionary tree. Some reptiles have ended up stumbling upon warm-bloodedness, and mammals, a previous split from reptiles, have also figured out warm-bloodedness, what we call being endothermic versus being ectothermic. Let me get through the list real quick, and then I want to talk about advantages and disadvantages of being warm-blooded or cold-blooded. Birds are warm-blooded, so are mammals. The other things aren't. What's the trade-off there? So we'll talk about birds real quick, and there's even like some new fossil evidence that's showing up that indicates, this is fossil dinosaur evidence that indicates some of those dinosaurs were in fact warm-blooded, which makes sense. We know that warm-bloodedness has to show up somewhere along the dinosaur lineage. After all, birds are warm-blooded. The other species examples that have lines drawn through them are also extinct dinosaurs. The plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, these are aquatic marine reptiles. Here's a picture of one. Let's just jump to extinct reptiles. This is a picture of the skeleton of one of those pterosaurs, those big flying reptiles. The wingspan here is about 26 feet. So these things were scavengers that just kind of cruised over the valleys out in West Texas and would, kind of like buzzards, see a meal and go scavenge it. This is a picture of the plesiosaur. It's an aquatic reptile that's got flippers, so it's clearly not adapted to life on land. And it's got a couple of reptilian characteristics. It's going to have scales, which are hard to see from this picture. It's got a bunch of cone-like teeth. This ichthyosaur, ichthyes just means fish, and then the saur is dinosaur. So this is a fish-like dinosaur. It looks a lot like a dolphin. And in fact, it's a good example of convergent evolution where this ichthyosaur and the current dolphin both occupy the same habitat and the same profession in that habitat. You can see how the habitat has shaped these organisms in a similar way. Torpedo-shaped body, paired pelvic and pectoral fins. But this thing is a reptile. We're going to see a bunch of cone-like teeth. You would see scales. It would be cold-blooded. So going back to this chart, the ones with lines drawn through them are extinct reptiles. The ones that are still with us, let's see, we've got turtles, we've got crocodiles, we've got birds, and then we've got this group that includes the lizards and the snakes. Squamates, that's the group that includes the lizards and the snakes. This separate group called tuataras, those are ancient lizards. So lepidosaurs are lizards and snakes. I just wrote lizards and snakes as the group of reptiles. What we need to know about each of these groups, whether this is the tuatara, it's an ancient lizard. You can see its legs are out to the sides of the body, whereas more modern lepidosaurs have their legs kind of underneath, so they can support themselves away from the ground. Squamates, like these snakes, they're cousins to lizards, but they've adapted to a burrowing lifestyle, so they've lost their legs altogether. We can see turtles and crocodiles here, or in this case the alligator, are all living examples of reptiles. What we need to know that they all have in common, going past the extinct ones, all reptiles are going to have a shelled egg. That's not unique to reptiles. Mammals are going to have that too, but all reptiles lay a shelled egg. They all reproduce without water, and how that happens is through internal fertilization. We're not going to see that on any of the videos, but last time we saw the video of amphibians reproducing, and fertilization was all external, often with very little contact between males and females. The females would drop their eggs into a puddle of water, and the males would drop their sperm into a puddle of water, and the sperm and egg would meet in that puddle of water. It's a much more tricky operation for reptiles, birds, and mammals that have to do internal fertilization. In addition to internal fertilization, like I mentioned, reptiles, just like birds and mammals, are going to have a tough keratinized skin. In the case of reptiles, it's scales that provide that waterproofing exterior coat. For birds, it's going to be feathers. And before I show this video, I want to go ahead and introduce this comparison between being warm-blooded and being cold-blooded. We're going to see that all of these reptiles, like this snake, they are cold-blooded, and sometimes cold-blooded and warm-blooded are loosely used. Like cold-blooded in this case doesn't mean cold shoulder or something like that, or mean or something like that. It's referring to the fact that these organisms, their body temperature is controlled by external factors. So if it's cold outside, the internal temperature of these ectotherms is also going to be cold. If it's really hot outside, then their internal body temperature is also going to be hot. It mimics whatever the exterior environment is. These ectotherms, you can see here their body temperature can fluctuate at a much wider range than endotherms. Endotherms are warm-blooded animals. Our examples of warm-blooded animals are just mammals and birds. Okay, so anything that's not a mammal or bird is going to have a body temperature that fluctuates drastically. Now, the good thing about being warm-blooded, like we can see, no matter what the temperature is outside, warm-blooded animals are going to maintain a relatively consistent internal temperature. We've done this all year. In the wintertime when it was really cold, you got out into your car, and even though it was really cold outside, your bodies, if you got too cold, you would shiver. There are things your body can do to maintain internal body temperature. Even when it gets too hot, your body can sweat to cool off. So there are all these physiological mechanisms that endothermic animals have that they can use to regulate their body temperature. Ectothermic animals don't have any of those, so they just fluctuate with whatever the environmental temperature is. Okay, so we've defined ectotherm and endotherm. Now I want to talk about the advantages and disadvantages to each. I'll just say this with words, so try and write it down. I'll repeat it a couple of times. Let's start with ectotherms. These ectotherms, you can see their body temperature fluctuates greatly, which I'll just say the disadvantage of that is that your metabolism, kind of how active you are, is predicated on your body temperature. So cold-blooded animals like this snake, if it's cold outside, then they are cold inside. And if they're cold, they don't move as quick. They're slow and sluggish. If they want to be more active and move around more quickly, then they're going to need to warm up. And they can't warm up just by shivering their muscles. They have to wait for the environment to warm up, or they have to go find a sunny rock and bask and warm up. If we'll see when their body temperature warms up, then they can be more active. But at some point, that sun is going to go down. So all of these cold-blooded animals, all amphibians and all reptiles, they're at a disadvantage when the sun goes down because they cool off and they're less active when things cool off. I learned this first the hard way. There was years ago where I caught one of these snakes, probably about this size, and I brought it into the classroom and it bit me in front of everybody, and it was one of the more embarrassing stories I could tell. But I've learned since then that if I catch a live snake, to not handle it while it's at room temperature. Instead, I'll just take the bucket that it's in and put it in the refrigerator for about 30 minutes. And as the core body temperature of that snake cools down, it slows down. And when you dump it out on the table for about 15 minutes, it's like in slow motion. So you can grab it and make your measurements or do whatever you have to do. But when it heats up, watch back out, because then it's going to be active and trying to strike you again. That's why, in the evenings when the sun is going down, these animals don't want to cool off, so they stretch out on the road and try and stay warm a little bit longer into the night so that they can be a little bit more active. Okay, so to review, cold-blooded animals, their body temperature fluctuates from cold to hot. If it's cold, they're sluggish. If it's hot, they're more active. I'll say the advantage of having your body temperature fluctuate like that, it frees you up from having to maintain your body temperature through metabolism. I'll say it this way: if you have to maintain your body temperature just through those metabolic tricks like shivering muscles or producing sweat, that has very high energy demands. So animals that are warm-blooded have to eat way more than animals that are cold-blooded. The advantage of being cold-blooded is that you can survive on so much less. Is anybody... I haven't had snakes as pets, but some of my buddies have had large snakes as pets. And they can go like 1 month, or they can skip, every other month in feeding these snakes. And for a snake, that's fine, no big deal. And again, that's because cold-blooded animals, they don't have to regulate their body temperature through metabolism, so they can survive on so much less. Imagine if, some meteor hits, or if conditions get stressful where there's not enough resources, cold-blooded animals have an advantage because they can survive on so much less. Mammals, we have to eat multiple times a day. And the reason we have to eat so much is because we're constantly doing those metabolic tricks to maintain our internal body temperature. So let's say that again. Cold-blooded animals, ectothermic animals, the advantage is that they can survive on so little. They can eat once a month or once every other month. The disadvantage is that they are up to the outside environment as to whether or not they are warm and active or cold and sluggish. They can't regulate that on their own. So the disadvantage is that on cool mornings, I sometimes go camping along the river. It's one of my favorite places. And in the morning, sometimes in the cool morning, I will hear these packs of raccoons just going up these creek beds. And what they're doing in the morning, before the sun comes out, all of the amphibians and the reptiles are just... They're like they just came out of the refrigerator. They're slow and sluggish. They're at a disadvantage because they're not active yet. Warm-blooded animals like the raccoons, they are active. Their body temperature is already warmed up. But again, to jump over here, I'm trying to give away the advantage of being warm-blooded is that you're constantly able to be active. But the disadvantage is that you have to eat so much more to maintain that body temperature. So again, it's kind of a perfect example of what's going on here in the early mornings when these packs of raccoons are roaming the riverbeds. If they see a frog, they can just grab the frog and eat it. If they see the snake, they can, with very little fight from the snake, they can grab the snake and eat it. These cold-blooded animals are at a disadvantage in the cool morning or at night. That's why for the longest time mammals were nocturnal, and it wasn't until the dinosaurs were killed off by that meteor that mammals were able to move into the day. We could spend all semester on this, so I'll try not to go down too many side paths, but that's also why reptiles and birds, since they've been in the daytime for many millions of years longer than mammals have, their eyes have adapted. You know, birds have like 7 different cones in their eyes for picking up different shades of colors, where mammals just have 3 different types of cones in their eyes. So our eyes are inferior compared to the eyes of birds. We'll see some mammals, like the bats, have figured out how to fly. Those bats have been flying for less than 50 million years. Birds have been flying for over 150 million years. So again, reptiles, in many cases, are going to have an advantage on mammals. But when we're comparing cold-blooded and warm-blooded, again, mammals, the disadvantage is they have to eat so much more, but the advantage is that they're active even in those cool mornings or even at night. Okay, warm-blooded versus cold-blooded. We talked about reptile characteristics. Again, all reptiles are cold-blooded. But one of those groups of reptiles, we're going to see this group of reptiles that ended up in including the dinosaurs. At some point, I know I didn't draw the dinosaur branch on here, some of those dinosaurs ended up evolving into endothermy, being warm-blooded. And one of those surviving branches of those dinosaurs ended up being the birds. So all of the birds that we can see in these pictures, they have colonized islands. You can see this one is a group of penguins that are in the Antarctic. These show how successful some of the birds have been. You know how we saw a video some early in the semester when we were looking at kind of a quick video of evolutionary history. It showed how, and we kind of just were talking about it, how tetrapods eventually adapted to life on land. We saw how amphibians were trying to break that link with water last time. We're going to see how reptiles and mammals fully break that link with water and adapt to the interior of the land, and they become so successful that some of those reptiles go back into the water, and even some of the mammals go back into the water. I was just about to show with these penguins, even some of the birds that have figured out flight go back into the water and lose the ability to fly. All right. So let's look at some general characteristics that all birds have in common. We can say that all birds have feathers, but as I was kind of mentioning earlier, feathers they actually show up in the fossil record before birds do. So feathers were on dinosaurs before birds were around. So what is a bird then? A bird, you have to have more than feathers to just be a bird. Some other characteristics that make a bird a true bird is that it has adaptations for flight. Feathers are now being used to help these animals fly, but I'd mentioned originally feathers were probably used for insulation and then to display to potential mates. Later, after these other adaptations that birds went through, these other adaptations I'm about to mention all have to do with lightening the overall weight of the bird so that it can get into the air. We'll see the bones in birds are hollow. So if you look at cross-section through this arm bone, you can see the bones inside are hollow. That lightens the overall weight of those bones. Bones are heavy. So if we look at this picture, the skull of a bird is going to have a reduced number of bones in it compared to a reptilian skull. Bones are heavy, so if we reduce the number of skull bones, this lightens the overall weight of the skeleton. Another interesting adaptation that birds have is that females have only one ovary, and that again is an attempt to lighten the overall body plan of these birds. Two other structures that lighten the overall body plan. In reptiles, there is a jaw with cone-like teeth. And in birds, the jaw with teeth are totally gone, and that jaw has been replaced with a beak. That beak is also made out of keratin, and we're going to see that it is highly adaptable. So beaks are lighter than jaws. The tail, in reptiles, there's a bony tail in all of reptiles, and we're going to see that in birds that bony tail is lost. It's replaced by feathers. Feathers again are lighter. Most of these are adaptations to lighten the overall body plan. This second to last one here, the keeled sternum, is not to lighten the overall body plan, but it's to provide those flight muscles with a place to attach. Here is that keel. You can think of the keel as like that fin that sticks out on a surfboard. And this little fin that sticks out on the sternum, on the breastbone of this bird here, you can see it increases the surface area so those flight muscles have a place to attach to. We see the bony tail is gone. It would be replaced with feathers. We can see there is a beak instead of a jaw with teeth. You can see hollow bones. So we listed several adaptations that birds have for flight. Here are some examples of birds actually doing the flight. I have these pulled up already, so let me just show a couple of clips of this. And I'm actually reminded, somehow we ended up in birds automatically, which birds are warm-blooded. Before we look at the bird videos, let me show you this quick clip of reptiles. We won't watch the whole thing, but it shows how those reptiles are cold-blooded and have to deal with that disadvantage of being sluggish when they're too cold. So I'll stop it there, but the key thing is that they're dependent on the environment to regulate their body temperature, to warm them up. It's going to take a little while to do so. And again, warm-blooded animals don't have to wait, but they do have to deal with the high energy demands. We were looking at birds real quick. So I had been plugging that birds have better vision because they've been operating in the daytime longer than mammals have. They also have much better flight because they've had about 1,000,000-year head start to evolve their ways in which they can hunt in the air. And here is an example of hawks hunting bats. Okay. So this is also, I think, fascinating. Not only are birds more agile predators in the air, they're also no slouches when it comes to intelligence. So in this slide, we just saw hawks picking bats out of the air. But we're about to see in the next two videos crows and how humans, in fact, how primates are not the only animal to figure out how to use tools. I'm going to show another clip of those birds feeding, but this is one that just shows how they actually learn how to make better tools. So I wonder if the crows have like tool building competitions where they compare and whatever. So there's a show like that. All right, let's jump. Sorry, there's one more fascinating bird video that I want to show, and this might be the craziest one. So they're even reading the streetlights to, figure out ways to get around cracking seeds that they wouldn't be able to do that normally. So we listed some characteristics of birds. Those are fascinating. And with just a little bit of time that I have left, I want to introduce mammals. And we could, again, spend all semester on mammals. I'll introduce them as far as I can today. And if there's anything else I need to mention on Monday, we will. But here are those 5 characteristics that I have listed underneath the branch of our tree that has led to mammals. The first characteristic we had started with, which was just the presence of hair. That is also made out of keratin, just like the scales and the feathers were. In addition to having hair, mammals are going to produce milk. mammary glands. So milk production, either one of those would work. There are, in the inner ears of mammals, we're going to see 3 inner ear bones, as opposed to reptiles and amphibians that are going to have just 1 inner ear bone. Here's what this looks like. In fact, I'll just go back to this. We're going to see 3 inner ear bones and 1 lower jaw bone. The 5th characteristic is differentiated teeth, or specialized teeth, that we see in mammals. Here's a picture of specialized teeth. In dinosaurs or crocodiles, any of those reptiles, they had only these cone-like teeth. Some of them were large cones, other ones were smaller cones, but they were all cone-shaped. And in mammals, we start to see teeth take on different shapes. They are specialized either for piercing into meat or for grinding seeds or plants. So you get different types of teeth with mammals, so that's unique. We've seen hair, milk production. The last 2 things were the bone structure. So on this slide, you can see in mammals, there's just a single lower jaw bone. This is what we would refer to as our mandible. And in reptiles, there are multiple bones that make up the lower jaw. If you've ever seen a video of one of those giant, like a boa constrictor, unhinging its jaw to take in a large prey item, reptiles can do this. They've got multiple bones that make up their lower jaw, where mammals can't. They've got the single lower jaw bone. You can also see specialized teeth on the mammal, where when we're looking at the reptile, these are just cone-shaped teeth. Then in the inner ear, in mammals, there are 3 inner ear bones, the malleus, incus, and stapes, whereas in amphibians and reptiles, there's only 1 inner ear bone. The advantage here, having 3 inner ear bones as opposed to just 1, these are a much more delicate arrangement of ear bones, and they can pick up much more faint sound vibrations. So if you are a mammal, you can hear much better than you would if you were a reptile or an amphibian. Sometimes in people, if these 3 ear bones fuse together, it's called conduction deafness, and you have to get a hearing aid and turn that up because these bones are not as vibrating as much as they used to. So it's like reptiles have this conduction deafness. They've got only 1 inner ear bone. Specialized teeth, we mentioned specialized teeth. We've got hair and milk. So let's jump to this. This is a more detailed example of the mammal groups. And again, this overhead is kind of pixelated, so I think even standing back here, it's kind of difficult to read what those words are. So let me just say this verbally. This first little branch has taken us to the branch of all mammals. It's kind of what we started with here. And you can see our first branch of mammals is going to get split into 3 different groups. There is Protheria, which is this first branch. Protheria describes this primitive group of mammals that still lay eggs. I don't know that you can make out any of those specific mammal orders, but you might be able to see that the first 3 have a little asterisk next to them, indicating that those are extinct lineages of mammals. There's only one example of egg-laying mammals that still are around today, and that's this group called the monotremes. So Monotremata is the only order of egg-laying mammals that are around. So Protheria is before live birth. And then here we have the branch of Theria, actual live birth. So when we look inside this the branch of animals that have mammals that have live birth, there is Metatheria. These are just the pouched mammals. They would include the marsupials, so all of the pouched mammals belong to this Metatheria group. And then the other branch is the Eutherian group, the true placental mammals. And all I'm really wanting to show with this chart is that the Eutherian, these placental mammals, you can see this is where by far most of those mammal orders are coming from. It's the most diverse of these 3 branches. So placental mammals, these Eutherian mammals, make up the majority of mammal types. You can see only 1 living order of egg-laying mammal and 1 living order of marsupial, these pouched mammals. Everything else is going to be a placental mammal. One of the things that I want to ask as we get into the mammals here is, why is it And here's another chart that shows the same thing. You can see the first branch of Protheria, the egg-laying mammals. The next branch that includes live birth. This is broken into the marsupials and then the placental mammals. What I like about this is that it puts an actual number to it. So you can see about 5 living species of egg-laying mammal, around 300 species of pouched mammal, but over 5,000 species of placental mammals. So by far and away, placental mammals are the most successful. We want to answer by the end of this initial discussion, why are these placental mammals able to adapt and speciate in so many ways when marsupials are not able to? Okay, so let's hang that in there for a second. Let's look at some examples of these animals. We're going to start with the monotrims, these egg-laying mammals. There are 2 living species, the echidna, which is this spiny-looking anteater-like organism. It's got a beak-like mouth that has no teeth. It's got a long, sticky tongue and these formidable claws that it digs up a termite mound or an ant mound, and as the ants are going all over the place, it just licks them up with its long, sticky tongue. It lays eggs, so you can see a shelled egg that's about the size of a thumbnail, and there's the little baby that's breaking out of the shell. We're going to see, being mammals, they have mammary glands, they produce milk. These echidnas, as well as the platypus, even though they produce milk, they don't secrete that milk through a nipple. Instead, it's secreted through a little groove on the belly side of these organisms, and the young have to lick that milk from the groove. Let's look at a video of that just real quick. These are all short. Here's the echidna video. Well, it's also going to be true that the duck-billed platypus has that same ability to sense electromagnetism in their beak, and that's how they find aquatic invertebrates in the water, by flipping over those rocks and detecting with their beak if there's any electrical activity there. So that's the echidna. Let's look at this platypus real quick. It's also a very short little video on the platypus.
I'm going to say a little bit.
So one of the things that it doesn't show in this video is that these first primitive mammals, these Protheria, the egg-laying mammals, one other thing that they have in common with their reptilian sister taxa is that, you know, all reptiles, they have just one opening at the distal end of the organism called a cloaca. And that one opening called a cloaca has to do the multiple purposes of excreting solid and liquid waste, and also being the point of reproduction. So that cloaca, there's a lot going on there. In these egg-laying mammals, just like the echidna and this platypus, they also have a cloaca, this one hole that's doing reproduction as well as solid and liquid waste. When we get into marsupials, we're going to see, and this is super general, but we're going to see that marsupials, they're going to have 2 separate holes, one for solid waste and then a separate for liquid waste and reproduction. And then in placental mammals, these have separate passageways for liquid waste, for solid waste, and for reproduction. Anyway, let's jump back to the slides real quick. We've seen the echidna and this duck-billed platypus are examples of egg-laying mammals. They have structures similar to reptiles in the fact they lay eggs and they have a cloaca. Pouched mammals, these marsupials, are 2-hole mammals. They don't lay eggs. They give birth to live young, but we're about to see in this video what actually is birthed is an embryo that's about 2 weeks old. These embryos are tiny, so maybe what we're about to compare here, the last thing, is the advantages and disadvantages to being either a pouched mammal or a placental mammal. Remember, there are way more species of placental mammal than there are marsupials, but still there are advantages and disadvantages to each. Marsupials, maybe one advantage to giving birth is that it's not as, well, I guess I shouldn't say Whether it's painful or not, I don't know, but I'm just guessing that giving birth to a tiny little embryo isn't as laborious as giving birth to a young that's almost fully developed, which is what happens in placental mammals. Let's look at this little time-lapse video of showing how marsupials actually give birth. We're going to look at this in a kangaroo, but all of these wallabies, this bandicoot, these are all examples of pouched mammals, these marsupials, and they all have a similar part of their reproductive life cycle that we'll watch this video of real quick. I'll say this, in terms of advantages, one advantage to giving birth this way is that, well, obviously it's not as laborious of a process to give birth to a tiny embryo like that. The other advantage, even though this sounds like a terrible, maybe only 50% of an advantage, and that is if you are a mother that has a developing baby in your pouch and you're being chased by a predator, these mothers can actually get rid of their baby and survive. I know that's terrible, but they survive till the next year to have another child, right? Compare that to a placental mammal. A placental mammal doesn't have that option. So if you're a 9-month pregnant placental mammal that's getting chased by a tiger, that tiger is going to eat you and the baby. So you both are out. So again, maybe that's only a half-sided advantage. I'll say the big disadvantage to being a marsupial, and here's the answer why there's so fewer marsupial species than there are placental mammals. Marsupials, like we just saw in the video, they all have to crawl through the fur and into a pouch. So the term that I like to use to describe that is that all marsupials are morphologically constrained to retaining the 5 digits, the grasping forehands. We're about to jump to placental mammals real quick, and we're going to see that, I'll just close that off. We're going to see that placental mammals, just to get into the last bit, placental mammals are nourished through a placenta and they never have to crawl through the pouch and finish developing. So placental mammals never face this part of their life cycle where they have to have these grasping forelimbs. You may remember earlier on when we were talking about just evolution in general, I was using these terms like primitive versus derived. And it turns out these egg-laying mammals, these first primitive mammals, all had 5 fingers and 5 toes. And there are other mammals that have derived more specialized versions of that. So when mammals started to move out into cover the plains, move great distances, we see that they had a reduced number of digits, and things like horses are walking around just on a single digit. Having hooves like this helps you cover great distances, but it would not help you crawl through the fur and into a pouch. So the fact that mammals could adapt their forelimbs away from this 5-finger structure is completely dependent on the fact that they have broken this link with needing a pouch for finishing development, and they are now being fully developed by way of this placenta. So they no longer have the morphological constraints, and they can develop their forelimbs in a wide variety of ways. So this is one of the things that has led to these placental mammals being so much more diverse than the marsupials. Think about that. Any of the hoofed mammals, like a pig, a cow, a deer, anything that's got a hoof on it is a placental mammal. Any of these aquatic mammals, so the dolphins, the whales, any of those, like manatees, any aquatic mammal that has flippers, that's a placental mammal. You couldn't crawl through the fur and into a pouch with a flipper, bless you. And then even these flying mammals, so the bats, obviously you couldn't use that wing to crawl through the fur and into a pouch. So all of these bats are placental mammals. When this mode of giving live birth shows up, it led to just a huge variety of placental speciation, which is why we see over 5,000 species of placental mammals. This will be the last video that I show, and it just is an example of one of these crazy placental mammals. It's maybe one of my, other than primates, maybe one of my favorite orders of mammal. And this one is another one of these teethless mammals. It's adapted to live in Southeast Asia. What this does is it's kind of like an anteater in the sense that it just scratches up these termite mounds and these ant mounds, and with its long sticky tongue licks up those insects. This is a pangolin.
There to destroy it all over again.
So here in Central Texas, armadillos kind of fill the niche of those pangolins. They have claws, they scratch up ant mounds, and they lick up those ants. I had a beehive that almost got taken out by ants earlier this year, and I didn't know what I could put around the ants that would kill the ants but not hurt the bees. It turns out I couldn't find anything, and while I was doing my research, at night an armadillo came and scratched up the ant mound and licked up all the ants. So I went out there the next day and I saw it scratched up and all the ants were gone. I was really happy there. There were just 2 more slides that were on there. I won't go into great detail about them, but it's just, once again, if we were to zoom in closer to this placental branch and look at all the different types of placental mammals, we would see, again, they all have broken that link with a pouch. In the case of primates, we can see that primate fossils first show up about 58 million years ago. I think we had seen this earlier. All that I was wanting to do here is just show, like I feel like we've already had this conversation. I was using this to show how I had previously had a misconception about how evolution works. We had said that chimpanzees and humans are, like chimpanzees are our closest living relative. If we look inside our cells, we have 46 chromosomes in each of our cells, and they have 48 chromosomes in each of their cells. But like I said, I originally had this misconception that, well, if evolution is working and chimpanzees are the closest living relative to humans, I thought for a time in my life that at some point chimpanzees would evolve into humans. And that's not at all how it works. What's good about drawing these phylogenetic trees is that you can see this branching nature to each of these trees. So this branch of the tree, that if we go back in geologic time was about 7 million years ago, this branch existed at a time when there weren't any chimpanzees or humans. There was a common ancestor of these 2 groups that looked something like this, the Sahelanthropus. And over time, this population of Sahelanthropus split and diverged in 2 different pathways. One pathway ended up leading to chimpanzees, and the other pathway ended up leading to humans. So different adaptations like walking upright and using tools and changing their diet is what led to this lineage of humans. And our human branch has continued to branch and diverge, just like this chimpanzee branch has continued to diverge. It doesn't show it here, but there has been a separate branch off of this chimpanzee branch that led to bonobos. About 2.5 million years ago, a separate branch of chimpanzees called bonobos came into existence, and there are mostly behavioral differences between the chimpanzees and bonobos. But just again, don't expect chimpanzees to evolve into humans. Instead, expect each of those branches to continue to diverge from one another. Some branches might go extinct while others may flourish. But again, I'll close off our introduction to the 3 major mammal groups there.